Welcome back, Bob.
Welcome back, Jack. Where were we?
You don't remember? I was asking the great question. The big atheist gotcha. What I think it is the big atheist gotcha is, okay, if there's a God and God is good, why is there suffering in the world? Gotcha.
Well, I've got my answer. What's
Me
your
too,
answer?
but I think to really get into the answer, there's quick answers in there. Go ahead. Got your answer.
It comes back to free will, right? Like I said, like I was saying before, we have the free will to please our senses, to pursue our own self gratification, to try to become God, try to become immortal. We have the free will to do that, but free will comes with consequences. That means there are consequences to our actions. And so when we become very self-absorbed and we're not aware or not concerned with the suffering of others, then that comes back to us. And it can come back after multiple lifetimes. So we don't necessarily know why we're suffering in the moment, but so long as we are stuck pursuing this selfish path of fulfilling our own desires, we're going to be in that world of exploitation, and because that's what everyone is trying to do. All of the animals are trying to exploit to please their senses, and the animals who walk on two legs and speak fancy words are also largely trying to exploit other people to satisfy their own desires, and hence we get exploited ourselves and suffer.
I agree with everything you said. I think that suffering has a broader scope even than that. And the first thing to note about suffering is that there's suffering, and then there's what is your attitude about suffering, and what is your feeling about the suffering. Is like most suffering, certainly, that we experience in a very comfortable society, at least today. If we talk about what's it called, the Maslow hierarchy of needs, most of our suffering is pretty high up on some kind of the existential, like, why do I exist suffering, right? Or my girlfriend left me suffering.
Well, first world problems, as people like to say.
Yeah. Certainly, especially when you talk about the animal kingdom and everything else, a lot of the suffering there is related to very fundamental structural stuff about the reality we inhabit, eat or be eaten. And if you're the one being eaten, that may very well entail a degree of suffering. I want to digress on that topic. We're going to come back to this someday with bells on. But years ago, when I was studying, I was reading about remote viewing in Stanford Research Institute, and there's a physicist. I believe his name is Hal Puthoff. He actually lives. He's very old now. He lives in Austin, interestingly, near us. And he was before Stanford. So remote viewing was it was like a CIA-run government program out of Stanford University, in which they, broadly speaking, were dealing with psychic phenomena. And he ran the program, and then a man named Ingo Swann, who passed away a decade ago, was their principal remote viewer. He's not a character. He's an interesting guy. Anyway, before they got into the remote viewing stuff, the thing that opened him up, because he was a physicist, and they were performing. Have you and I talked about this before? The Ferns.
You mentioned him before. I don't remember getting.
I know we haven't done it on. Yeah. Anyway, I just was curious because I bring this up from time to time because I find it fascinating. You can see there's an interview. I heard this on an interview with Hal Puthoff from 20 years ago, and I think it's on the internet because that's where I saw it. And he had a friend. He was a physicist. He had a friend who was a biologist who wanted help setting up like all this electronic equipment to basically set up like these biometric like sensors on plants, on ferns, Similar to like lie detector stuff, like where they measure conductivity across the flesh and
They could detect when people just had the thought or just were talking about doing something.
okay. So what happened was they'd set this up and they were measuring in a very in a rigorous way the electrical impulses and stuff that were coming back from these devices they had set up. And they had a few different ones, but that when they cut a leaf off a fern, and they could map it like, yeah, you see the fern's upset or it's reacting, whether that qualifies as suffering or not. And then one day they had set the experiment up and they were talking about, okay, are you going to go cut the fern? And blah, blah, blah. And the fern reacted before they did anything, which introduces a lot of interesting questions about the nature of the mind, the nature of sensory input, and gets into the whole topic. I don't want to digress into this, but the point is that even if we say the suffering, it doesn't extend down into the plants, and so I don't know about that. Plants, they also they grow better when you play Bach versus if you play like death metal. There's no question that one lifts them up and one makes them suffer, and they respond appropriately. So suffering itself and what the nature of suffering is. Suffering, we experience suffering mostly when we don't get what we want or maybe need. We need air to breathe. Okay, I'm going to lock you in an evacuated room and suffocate you or something, or I'm going to choke you. I'm not going to choke you, but I don't even like saying stuff like that, but not for you. There's some things in this world, I think, so that's another whole other topic. But yeah, that there's something you want / need somewhere on that Maslow hierarchy, and you're not getting it, and you suffer. And of course, it's you, but who's suffering, first of all, right? The suffering is definitely happening in that 7-tiered system, right? It's happening at the layer 6 and lower. You agree probably with that?
Suffering in the body, suffering in the mind, suffering in the ego.
I don't know that I don't know to what extent there's any suffering at the soul level, although people can disagree, and maybe there is. Maybe there's suffering on that order too. I don't know. And I think that the suffering is actually...
I would say that the suffering is that we're not getting to that highest level. That's all it is when we're at that highest level.
And you identified that level 7 with the soul, and I think there's definitely a level, but beyond, that's a whole weird discussion. I don't know if I want to get into that right now about the nature of the soul or souls, or I think it connects also to the nature of angels, demons, gods, and these transpersonal manifestations. But so let's leave that aside. So what the point I'm trying to make, the bad communicator that I am, is that I think suffering is baked into the cake. It's inherent in the structure of consciousness. So, which is a bit radical and something that I don't know that you'd even agree with, but let me make my case. Okay, so the nature of consciousness basically is that it's a subject being aware of an object. Like, consciousness is awareness, right? And an awareness, if it's through time, which in our experience it is through time, although there are deep things we could start opining about the nature of time and this whole realm. But this is what we have to work with today. Okay, but let's just go with our assumption that we're in this existential quandary of this universe and everything else, because that's what we're inhabiting right now. Consciousness always involves a subject relating to an object. I am conscious of something, right? There's even our language embraces like a subject, predicate, object that by the way is in itself a pediment to describing Brahman, that's the never born. I love that. I've been listening to this Upanishads thing, and that's how typically it's a characterization, never born. which is a flip side of deathless, right? So not even ever born. Never, it's just permeating truth, transcendental reality. It's reality. It's ultimately what it is. That's why I like personal Godhead stuff. Anyway, let's put that aside. But whenever consciousness is engaged, you get this subject-object split. Now, ironically, at the highest level, the subject is the object, right? If we're talking about the Godhead, the subject and the object are identical, right? The Maya in this context, the Mahamaya, maybe to some extent the Yogamaya too. Maybe it's all a matter of how we take it. I don't know. But Maya in this context is obsessing really on the perception and the reflection. It's like the whole of existence is God looking at a mirror. Okay? And the Maya error, the egoic error, and we're all these fractal fragments of the Godhead, right? Everything is. You, me, that guitar, this computer, the cloud, the planet, the sun, the society is some kind of group. Every single dimension of this is some dimension of an absolute reality that itself is ultimately completely without attributes, timeless, formless, right? It's the 0 point. It's a vanishing point of truth. And we're going to get into that too. So, and the suffering is baked into, it's inherent in the process of consciousness reflecting upon itself. I'll stop there for a second. Are you feeling that, or do you have a clarification or disagreement, or go ahead?
I have some kind of a different ontology. I agree with a lot of it. I think a lot of it's definitely founded in reality. Just the way I have it, kind of a different ontology. That basically God has three potencies. There's the internal potency, the external potency, and the marginal potency. So God's internal potency is the spiritual world, which is what we can attain when we overcome the illusion of Mahamaya. The external potency is the material world. It's all this stuff that's this shiny stuff that we pursue in our lives. And the marginal potency is who we really are, all of the living beings. And so we're talking about suffering specifically. So suffering is something that takes place in the material world, and to the extent it takes place in the spiritual world would be just part of the show. That there's a transcendental suffering there, which it's just another flavor. Just like you can have sadness, watch a really sad movie and it drives you to tears, but there's something really beautiful in that. And so in the spiritual world, we have the transcendental emotions, which have these different flavors. But here we get caught up, and it's just like that flavor is too strong and we don't get the beauty. Sometimes we just get.
It would take me a while to process the three potencies. I work out of a model that is my kind of casual understanding, again, in my dilettante way of Advaita philosophy, which you can go watch, like people who are really well read in Vedanta, putting aside the fact that there are, just like there is in any textual religious / spiritual discussion, there are apparent contradictions in the Vedanta that I don't know what you want to get into, because I'm not really that interested in it. I'm only interested in it to the extent that it has utility observationally in my life experience, right? That's why I'm not a Christian. It's not only the esoteric practice, it's being able to integrate the esoteric practice and what it reveals to me about life. So that in that model, the dualism, the apparent dualism that is not really dualistic, that is non-dual ultimately, is this apparent split between Shiva and Shakti is how it would be metaphorically represented, where Shakti is the wife of Shiva, right? And where Shiva is the experience of it's the existential experience of consciousness.
It's stillness and motion.
But Shiva is the absolute, is echoic or representative of. I usually hear it pronounced with a h, like Brahman. Brahman, is that correct? You're way more for the absolute.
I mean, people say it different ways. Different Indians have different accents.
I know, right? Indians got more languages. They've got a lot of languages in India.
They even argue amongst themselves about proper pronunciation.
It's one of the reasons. It's one of the reasons why pretty much every Indian speaks English. Because otherwise they couldn't. The whole subcontinent wouldn't really be able to communicate. It's become the lingua franca just to piss off the French, who are not the lingua franca. And I'm not a huge fan of the Anglo Empire, but whatever. Okay, so in this context, so in that kind of like representative model, so I have an analogy that I'm just itching to put on the table, and you've heard me do this. I think we were walking a long time ago, and it's the idea that is often represented as a wheel, right? The wheel of karma. I want to say that like the etymology of that word has wheel in it somehow, but I don't know that I'm right. I looked it up on a Sanskrit scholar dictionary, and I didn't really get that. But do you have any insight into that? Karma and the wheel?
The wheel of karma is definitely a thing. I don't know if it's built into the word itself. Yeah. It might be. That might be a context. But the Sanskrit etymology gets pretty complex.
Yeah.
Basically, like every syllable you can conceive of has multiple connotations, and so and then you just get into
etymology. Generally is tricky and complex in any language. So let's put it. Maybe someday can correct us and inform us about that. So, but regardless, the idea of the wheel of karma is represented in a lot of contexts across both Hinduism and Buddhism, right? So, if you think about us existing, like our existential reality being on a circle, right? Okay. And by the way, we could be going this way, or we'll talk about that in a second, because I extended my metaphor into the direction of the circle, because the circle is actually a spiral. There's multiple dimensions to the circle. Anyway, but we're going to talk about that more. Okay, so I'm getting ahead of myself, because I'm a bad communicator. So how I like to conceive of this is that Shiva is, I'm sorry, so the Shakti, the existential reality is out on the edge of the circle. And it's phenomenologically all we can experience through our body, breath, mind, that whole chain. Although that could be weird, subtle things for a plant or a planet. Who knows? Because it's all consciousness, y'all. There's nothing here that isn't an element of consciousness.
Yeah.
Even the inanimate objects, everything else. I mean, degrees, let's say, of consciousness. But it exists out here on the rim of the circle. So Brahman, Shiva, the other part of that Advaitic dichotomy, is the center of the circle, which we can only infer from our experience around the rim of the circle, right? Which is why enlightenment talk always fails, because our enlightenment talk is all out here on the circle, because everything out here is about epistemology. It's about knowing, also knowing through experience. It's about experience and knowing, but it's ultimately the real question. So what do we do when we meditate? We're trying to still all the noise around the vibration around the circle and somehow draw a direct connection to the center of the circle, to the absolute reality that's in the circle, that we can only really experience, but it's what we're meditating out here. It's a paradox. That's the thing, is that the consciousness, and especially trying to describe consciousness. This is in mathematics too, right? This is like the Gödel incompleteness theorem. If you took the totality of our epistemological experience of the world as some logical construct, it's inherently incomplete. And for it to be complete, it has to be contradictory. That's the Gödel inclusion.
Yes.
We can do a whole other thing about that sometime. But so
that's why time must go on. If we were ever completed in our experience, we would cease to exist, wouldn't we?
That's absolutely true, right? Which gets into the kind of the funny part about this riddle. So let's keep on this circle. So far, so we're having an experience out here, which is about us experiencing and knowing, and then we have this absolute in the center that we can never touch, but we can infer, right? Now, there's a very interesting aside that I definitely want to talk about. I don't want to overload like a single conversation, but about the relationship of a circle. Here's my counter to the atheist argument about there is no such thing as it's just pure phenomenology, and it has to do with numbers. Should we do this now? Or should we, you know what? Let's not do this.
Were you going to talk about real numbers?
Transcendental numbers and all that. You know what? Let's do that in a whole separate thing. We'll come back to the circle and we'll talk about pi and stuff some other time in transcendentalism and everything else. You have this circle, you have this relationship to the circle that you can only infer. And then you also have, and I had that idea for a while. I think I woke up one day and I had this, it's like a circle, But then later I thought, and there's also this idea of the teleology. That's another big word in philosophy, is not only the epistemology of what we know and the ontology of what actually is. And when you talk about ontology, and when you and I talk about ontology, we're not necessarily meaning we're talking about Brahman. We're talking about the absolute reality that permeates everything. That's the ontological truth with a capital T. That through our experience in our little egoic selves, probably even in our soul selves, anything that's a subset that is not itself identical with ultimate reality is going to get into this trap of thinking that, oh, no, it's me. I ultimately, and the thing is, you ascend a power. If we were becoming more powerful, let's put that aside. Let's come back to power and this idea of I'm going to become God, okay? So the teleology is which way do you spin? Because actually, there's a normal to the circle I have. I got to put it in the video. I have a circle, right? I should probably make a visual presentation. I'm not good at that stuff. So I have a circle, right? But there's also going in and out of the circle. So there's an idea of moksha, of liberation, right, from the wheel of karma. And I've heard people. I just was watching some video for not even this reason, but it was like a kindred spirit. But they were talking about doing practices to burn karma, and I was like, man, there are not enough practices and enough lifetimes for you to burn all the karma. You're never going to burn the karma. It's that story about the Buddha and the acolyte are walking along the river, and the acolyte says, well, can I ever, how much karma will I ever be free of the karma? And the Buddha looks at him and says, yeah, they're walking along like Ganges or something. You see the river? Yeah, I see the river. You see the beach on the side of both sides of the river? Yeah, I see the beach. And can you see near us? You can see all the grains of sand on the beach, and you see it stretching off to the horizon, right? And that itself is only a grain of sand to the karmic weight that you carry around from all the lifetimes that you've accumulated. You're never going to burn off the karma, guys. I'm not, and this is not an advocacy for now let's become Sabbatean Frankists and just sin with impunity, because that's not what I'm advocating. You should be striving to not be an asshole still, right? But it ain't gonna. You could be like, there's monks in being a Buddhist. They'll say a prayer as they're walking to try to burn off the karma of all the micro critters that they're killing with each step, right?
Microaggressions, man.
Yeah, that's a whole different level of microaggression. So grace is how you achieve liberation.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to achieve liberation by some process running around the circle. It's got to come from some other dimensionality, right?
You have to get out of the hamster wheel,
right?
To go somewhere.
You actually have to get off the hamster wheel. You got to step off it that way. You're not going to run faster around the hamster wheel somehow. And this gets back into esoteric practice and meditation and so forth and so on. That said, and I was just opining, but I'm not advocating don't go around being an asshole, is there are still definitely different ways to run around the hamster wheel. There's a clockwise and a counterclockwise. And I believe that idea of spin around the circle ultimately relates to dharma, and it relates to suffering, and relates to all that stuff. But for the most part, the basic spin is this. It's either empathetic or pathic, right? The sociopath is their attention on their actions is on what is going to be good for me. Mm-hmm. The empath is what's going to be good for us. And the bigger the us, the better. If it's a completely big us, that's
divine.
That's the divine. That's the biggest us there is. And
yeah, even the perpetrators and the villains are included in there too.
All part of the story.
Give them what's coming to them. They deserve it.
Yes, that's been a big change in my thinking. Is that, and I read the Gita, Bhagavad Gita again. How is it? It was right before I moved, and I was just struck by the idea. And my late mother, when I was asking her, at what point do we act? And I don't want this to become like a socio-political one. We're going to have plenty of time for that, and it's ultimately the right action is going to be found. You're only going to ultimately find it in what's dharmically correct is going to be dictated by absolute reality. And to the extent that you're driven by some egoic agenda, that's the extent to which you're going to fail. You might succeed, you might fulfill your agenda, but on a bigger scope, you're failing. So this is
then you'll have to face the consequences of your actions.
Right, and that will accumulate karma and so forth and so on. You'll still be on the wheel. You'll be on the wheel forever and ever doing that. There's another thing that I had. This is when I was real sick in the hospital, and this is when I had come up with this idea before then. I had this circle thing, and then I started thinking about grace, and then I was like confronting the possibility that I might die like immediately. And I had the other idea of, then we have a circle coming out of here. It's like the magician's rings, right? Like and then I have another circle coming out. Okay, now that's just its own circle. This like gets into like soul stuff and everything else. Now, and then there's another circle. Ultimately, all of that. This is why I'm not super comfortable. There could be a God of this circle. I'm not sure if ultimate reality transcends every single conceptualization of it, transcends every stupid metaphor I could ever throw at it, circles, squares, triangles, whatever, all of which are real important. You're a better geometer than I am. But this idea of knowing that the Shiva Shakti question, the Advaita, the dialectic, is bound up in this tension between experience and knowing, and this absolute. But now, as you've pointed out, I don't want to turn it back over to you because I've been going for way too long. So this is a paradox of consciousness, is that the absolute, without an experience, what is it? The absolute is meant to and inclined to experience, right? It has to, so
you can't get off the wheel. You can get off a wheel, but you get on another. That ties back into Yoga Maya,
you said about
right?
Time.
Let's get back to Yoga Maya. Instead of on this materialistic wheel where I'm trying to accumulate and hoard, I'm on the wheel of the transcendental wheel, where I'm with God and all of these eternal associates of the divine.
The Yoga Maya as opposed to the Maha Maya. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. And in either event, and that's another word that a word that I've known for a long time that you brought up is lila.
Mm-hmm.
the play of it, and which also connects back to suffering, that if you are on a certain
So this whole
level,
karma game is a leela of sorts.
I was going to say level of understanding, but I don't want to be finger waggy about it, like I'm on a higher level than you. But what were you saying? I'm sorry.
I was just saying the whole karma wheel is a leela of itself, a kind of leela. It just gets exhausting sometimes.
It's very exhausting. It's especially exhausting in our current situation as a species and on our planet and everything. This notion of that, okay, so that's my offering back to you about this relationship between Shiva and Shakti and that ontology and epistemology. Dharma, and the Greek word then is like teleology, or which could be interpreted as morality. But I think morality is a smaller word than dharma. I think morality very much relates to human. Maybe not. Maybe that's ethics. I'm not really good on those two words. I don't really get the distinction. I think ethics is. Do you have any ideas on those two words? Because I've always been uncomfortable with them. I usually hear concepts like ethics, thrown about by like journalists, at a symposium about journalistic ethics with somebody from CNN and Fox and MSNBC, all reassuring each other that they're all very ethical.
I perceive that ethics is usually more of a professional, formal concept, whereas morality is social and often religious in nature. So ethics is like the law is supposed to be ethical, whereas my own, what I'm doing in society, like with other people, with my family and friends, I'm going to strive for morality, and then I need to be ethical in my business conduct.
Then if we talk, so let's talk about morality. So one thing that you'll hear nowadays, especially from the types who would challenge our notions of God and consciousness and the spiritual versus materialist war, is a kind of moral relativism. And there's a question of, is there an absolute morality? And I believe there is, and I'm pretty sure you think there is too.
Right, but it has to be in context.
Right. And the context is governed by what? The dharmic, what ultimately is this notion of dharma? The notion of dharma is, are you in alignment with the Godhead? Are you it's not any law of man, okay? It has more to do, the Egyptian concept was mat, right? Was M-A, I think it's usually done M-A'-A-T. And this says European corollary, this is other Indo-European cultures, that is the true. Now, it's not a bunch of laws written by somebody calling themselves God dictated.
More like bureaucrats.
That's what we end up with. Now, and at the same time, I recognize that a civilization, to the extent that it is civilized, does need laws. It does.
Administration.
Right. Dharma, a dharmically connected holy person, if they're truly mirroring the Dharma, they are actually above those laws.
Yep. Right? Yep.
They're transcendent of the laws. And there definitely comes a point in social decay where the laws themselves are the enemy. And we're like way past that point in our society.
The total inversion of society.
Yeah. Right. And how is that ultimately going to be upended? That's going to ultimately have to be upended through violating all those evil laws. So to me, this tension, and then then let's talk about Satchitananda. Why don't you?
You want me to break that down?
I do, because I think it relates back to the everything we were talking about experientially, what we need to be focused on, and what the resolution of the non-dual in the dualism, the apparent split between this experiential, that at its worst we can engage a kind of Maya, a Mayic, approach on our and say, oh, that's the only reality, versus Brahman, the absolute, that is underpinning and permeating all of it. And in my opinion, like that's the essence of Sat Chit Ananda, is the union of those, the realization of that in a state of bliss. Go ahead, but you go.
So Satchitananda is the original state of the soul. And so it is three words, Sat, Chit, Ananda. So Sat is eternal. It is eternal. It is so absolute truth is eternal.
Brahman. Brahman. The absolute reality.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Yes.
Yes.
That's how I map it.
Yes.
All the words. Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. So our soul is eternal. Our soul has that property of Sat, but these other layers of consciousness, the body is always changing. The body will die, not eternal. The mind will go, not eternal. The intelligence changes from lifetime to lifetime. Sat, we have that in the soul. And Chit is the conscious, the intelligence, that discernment quality, that propensity for knowledge. So we have that as well, that Chit. And when we apply this knowledge,
which is very much like epistemological and experiential, and right.
Yes,
that's on the Sat is the middle of the circle. Chit is out here on the edge of the circle.
That's an interesting analogy. That makes sense to me.
Okay.
And so when this discernment is applied properly in the world, then the result is ananda, bliss. And when Chit is misapplied, when we don't use our discernment, we don't have the proper knowledge, then we fall into a pit of suffering. So Sat Chit Ananda is this is a form of God. God is always in these qualities. And so when we escape from this moksha, get off of this hamster wheel, then that is the goal, is we achieve this state of Sat Chit Ananda, transcendental.
Or, so, and I didn't originate this, but another take is that the mission in this experience is to bring about the perfect marriage of Shiva Shakti, Sat Chit, and that is where bliss happens in this reality, that this is what a realized, say, avadhut is actually manifesting, is the union, the non-dual union between the still point in the middle of the circle into the circle, like the degree to which that resonance is happening, that alignment is happening, that is where the ananda happens. That's the nature of bliss. People take bliss on a lot of levels of just feeling really good on stuff, or I'm all blissed out. I was meditating and I'm all blissed out and I feel really good. I think the ananda in this context is another level. I think that there may be levels of it that are similar to the Shaktipat experience, like the kind of that, I don't know. I think I've touched it a couple of times. I've touched various forms of it, but I'm definitely nowhere near realized, and I'm not prepared to go out on that limb.
Well, people are always chasing the bliss, right? They want to skip the first two steps and go straight to the bliss. It's like, I don't care if it's eternal. I don't care if it's intelligence. Just give me the drugs. I'm going to feel good.
Which is very, I don't know, that if you're not really trying to build the bridge between Sat and Chit, then like you're going to end up with, you might feel good today, but
right. But it's not eternal. It's not that, it's lacking that Sat.
Yeah, which is straight back to the kind of Mayic. We're just going to use that word now. I've declared.
You've been using this word for years.
I've always used it. Mayic.
I feel like I've heard you use it forever.
I feel like it's pretty new. I've been known to be wrong before, especially as I get older. I'm wrong more. My chit is getting more and more fuzzy. I don't know. Yeah. Does it matter though? That's a beautiful fool thing as one ages, is that the formalities seem to matter less and less.
Did I hear you say the word avadhut earlier?
Avadhut, I think.
Did you say that word earlier?
I think I did. It's avadhut.
Oh, I was just surprised to hear you use that word. I didn't get the context of that. That has
the guy that I got. So I got my Shakti pot from someone who got it from someone who got it from someone who is at least nominally. I don't know. He died in the 50s, and he was a classic avadhut. He was like a classic. Nityananda. I'm not qualified to talk about Nityananda at all. I meditate. I think about him. I don't have any. No qualifications here, but I know a lot of the narrative around him. But this is a guy who, I mean, he only wore a loincloth, man, because his devotees begged him to, because it was distracting to have him sitting naked for a lot of people, especially as when the Westerners started filing in later in his life. He seriously, just be profane about it, he just didn't give a solitary fuck. This was like, the whole thing of the body and all, whatever, you know. And that's very avadhut. I know earlier in his life he would sit in a posture in front of, I think it was, I want to say it was a Kali temple, but I don't know. And it was part of his whole evolving self-testing and stuff. And kids, he'd sit there just fasting. The priest would bring him water once in a while for days. And little kids would throw shit at him, and he'd just laugh it off, didn't care. He was all the way there, man. Right. I don't know where I don't know. And then they have very postulates about what he was manifesting, what he might be avatar of. And I love him because he was a hard ass. Go ahead.
The recommended path is to do things properly and structured, and there are so many rules, regulations, but then someone who's beyond all of that, someone who's actually transcended, the rules don't really mean anything.
Yeah,
so this is why avadhut is. Yeah, avadhut can be a legitimate personality.
Well, and that was what it was believed, because he was so young.
And he was called Nityananda.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, there's another Nityananda in the 16th century who was also called
Nityananda today. It's pretty common.
But he was also called avadhut.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know about him. I just know about the one who was he's the founder of Siddha Yoga, and he had Muktananda. And then Muktananda died, and now it's run by Guru Mai, although her brother then all the problems happened. That's with every single, replete with all the like sexual, like every time, right? She never heard that about Nityananda though. And if you had, would it even matter? That's a kind of a funny topic about all that stuff, about how you always have this like trend in, so like you had it with Maharishi came from, I'm sorry, what's his name?
Ananda Saraswati.
Saraswati. I'm sorry, I couldn't remember. One of my many sins. I have harder, if I am not really into it, man, the names are just, as I get older, I just can't remember all the names. Yeah. And there's a kind of pattern in that where you have, with Nityananda, what I'm more familiar with, you had like the guy who he literally lived in a cave. They made him wear a loincloth, and they built the ashram around his cave. That's literally what happened. Because this is my cave. Shakti, whatever, what do you call it? Telluric energy. There's all kinds of weird energies.
What'd you say? Telluric?
Is it telluric? What's the name for subtle energies on the planet? Like,
I don't know that word.
I don't know if it's. I might be wrong about that word. Anyway, it's like Barton Springs has a lot of weird energy where you go. Like you can feel like Austin there's a lot of subtle energy coming out of the planet right there. Anyway, they just built the ashram around him. Then Muktananda came along, and Muktananda had a big scandal around him. Then there were more scandals around his successors and so forth and so on. Maharishi had the famous scandal in the 60s around supposedly, which by the way, and I truly don't know. This gets into another social question, which is, as soon as women become involved, Sorry, ladies. But you're playing with fire.
That's the weakness of man.
It is the weakness of man, and it's also the weakness of women too. And that's why all these vows of sannyas and everything that I could probably take on a vow of sannyas now, but I certainly could not have taken that on at 20, man. I would have fallen off that wagon real fast.
I can say about Maharishi, I don't think he ever took a vow of celibacy because he was not a swami, he was a rishi.
Okay.
But a lot of these, so I don't know too much about that. I heard he had some affairs. But yeah, there are tons of actual swamis who are supposed to be celibate, and then they...
That was the case with Mutananda Swami. But and I'm not acute. There's a whole... You can go on the internet and find all the shit, and I don't know. I don't care that much. Like, I have my Shakti pot, right? And then it came to me from someone who got it from Mutananda. Mutananda got it from Nityananda. And the veracity of that stuff to me is not very relevant to, like, my Shakti pot. I got it. It's mine. My precious. You should get two people in the room, right? It's already a challenge. We're doing okay so far. We'll come back to my circle analogy. Sometime, and we'll talk about pi, the magic of transcendental numbers, because one of the reasons I like that circle analogy so much is that it's very adaptable to what's my ultimate refutation of the whole materialist narrative is that you can see the transcendental truth all around us. It's being constantly demonstrated in myriad ways, constantly. And what's so hilarious to me is how materialist the takes on science. Well, that's something we can get into next. Let's do that next time. So let's really get into science! Exclamation point.
Science.
Yeah, we'll have to go break out that old 80s Thomas Dolby tune, which is my favorite Thomas Dolby tune. Have you ever heard it?
Wait, what was that?
Have you ever heard there's a Thomas Dolby tune called She Blinded Me with Science?
Sounds familiar.
You probably were barely even born yet, or if at all, but we'll break it out for our next little talk. We'll start talking about science and how ridiculous this whole topic has become. We'll certainly come back to consciousness over and over again. But was this coherent? I don't know. I guess maybe someday some people will hear it and tell us whether it was. What do you think?
I think it was totally coherent. I don't know who's going to listen, but we'll put it out there. And
we have a plan. We have a plan for gathering listeners. We talked about that earlier. We're going to execute. We're going to execute our plan, and then maybe we'll have some listeners. And then I was saying, like, okay, well, be careful what you wish for, because as soon as we start to really talk about wrongthink, I'm sure the wolves will come out.
Well, I can't wait to get banned.
Does Telegram ban? I don't know if Telegram.
No, not on Telegram, but on YouTube. I'm going to put stuff on YouTube, see how long that lasts.
Oh, wow. I know all we got to say is Jew, and it'll be over. See? That's it. So this video's doomed.
It's already done.
It's already dead. All we got to say is anything like, maybe if I couch it like Abrahamic. I was already critical, and I'm not, by the way, I know a lot of Christians. Just little disclaimer. I probably should have said this earlier, who I care about and love deeply. And I live in a very Christian area, and I really like it. I really like it because people who have, even though the path may not be for me, and I know in their world I'm doomed to perdition, and I can live with that. Because as long as we're all saying please and thank you at the store, life's a lot easier when we're all grounded in. Anyway, Christianity in our country today generally correlates to a culture of at least surface politeness and ethics, and I'm all for that. So anyway, next time we're going to talk about science. So I'm going to find the Thomas Dolby tune, and we'll set it up.
All right. Talk to you later.
Om Namah Shivaya. Bye-bye.
Om Namah Shivaya.